Our next speaker is Clay Allsopp. Clay is the creator of GraphQLHub, which is a website, but also an open source project where you can query APIs like GitHub, Twitter, Reddit, Hacker News with GraphQL.
Cool. So I'm going to talk about evolving GraphQLHub. And as we were saying, did this work? Yeah, this kind of worked. Oh, well. GraphQLHub is a way to query popular APIs using GraphQL. So for example, like Hacker News, Reddit, Twitter, existing REST APIs. And it's a website. So you can go to GraphQLHub.com. You can poke around. It's also an NPM module. So if you ever want to include the ability to query Reddit or Twitter using GraphQL in your own apps, you can just NPM install GraphQLHub schemas and you're good to go. There's also a Medium publication where I write about a lot of GraphQL in-depth topics, which is also cool and under this sort of umbrella. And that's GraphQLHub.com. Can I do this trick? I can do this trick. Sweet. We've demoed a lot of graphical, and this is an example of our graphical using the Hacker News schema that we have. So you can see that we're getting a bunch of data from Hacker News, a bunch of posts. We're getting the authors. We're getting all kinds of really awesome data. On the side, you can kind of see the different APIs we offer and how this is part of the schema. I won't go into too much in depth, but it's fun. You should play around and put in your own Twitter handles or Hacker News handles and see what's out there. But the interesting thing is how this has evolved over the past year or so. Whoops. Cool. And basically, it started with these REST APIs that I converted to sort of GraphQL queries. And then I kind of got a better understanding of GraphQL after doing this a few times and made a more idiomatic approach to GraphQL. And that's a version that's more compatible with Relay. And then I also, as more people started to use this service, looked into performance and how do you actually instrument a GraphQL server. So the first part of this comes from Relay. I thought Relay was very, very cool, and I wanted to build some apps using Relay. But one of the prerequisites of Relay is that you have a GraphQL server, and I didn't have one of those lying around in August, and no one did. So I decided to roll my own. And what I wanted to do is I wanted to write this. I wanted to write an article on how to build a Hacker News client with Relay, which seems like a really cool way to dog food Relay, right? But there's no Hacker News GraphQL server. So instead, when I wrote this, I said, hey, you can use this thing called GraphQLHub. And that lets you query Hacker News using GraphQL. And in turn, that lets you use Relay and lets you collocate queries and do the awesome stuff that Joe was just talking about. So this was the version of the schema at that point in time. So you can see we're getting the top stories. There's this by field that returns an ID. There's this thing called kids, which seems kind of funky. And a lot of this is actually derived from the actual Hacker News REST API. So the Hacker News REST API uses the word kids. It uses IDs, score. These are all nouns that I borrowed directly from the REST API. But one of the cool benefits of having this on a GraphQL server is you can see in the original Hacker News API, these kids are actually just IDs. And so if you want to actually find a piece of information for this kid, you have to do another REST query. And so if you want to do in kids, you have to do in REST queries. And doing that on the client would kind of suck. So this is all actually a little bit done in parallel on the server. And that's one of the benefits of GraphQL is you can do these kind of parallelization optimizations, and the client doesn't have to know about it. And that's for a more extreme example, we're getting 5 kids, we're getting 5 more stories based on those. That's 25 total REST API calls. And this is all done on the server, which is nice, and it's all very declarative. And it lets us write this at the end of the day. A nice little Relay container for a Hacker News story. And so as a person writing an app, a mobile app or a web app, all I have to do is drop in this little bit of GraphQL and I'm good to go. And so that was around September-ish, and I added more support for Hacker News, Twitter, Reddit, some more. I didn't actually add Twitter. I'll get to that in a minute. But the next part of my exploration of this ecosystem was actually doing mutations. And mutations are a little bit more complicated than just getting data. Mutations are an inherently hairy thing. You need to change the data in a way both on the server and the client, and have some kind of like loading state while that happens, maybe do an optimistic update. And the cool thing is, if you use Relay, Relay has a very kind of well-defined system of how to do mutations. But to buy into it, you have to buy into all the other mechanisms that Relay prescribes. So essentially, Relay assumes that your GraphQL server isn't just random GraphQL, it's actually a well-defined GraphQL structure. So for example, it expects a top-level node field where you can query any object in your entire universe of objects. It defines a structure for pagination, which Joe was just talking about. And these are things that like most REST APIs like don't support out of the box. A lot of things, as we've talked about, use like limit and offset. They might do cursor pagination. They might do it in some other funky way that's not quite the way that Relay thinks about it. And so to make this illustrative, the way that Relay wants you to think about it is as your data as truly as a graph. So you can query any of these different objects in your graph independently. You can query the current user, or you can query any comment or post and the edges connected to them using globally unique IDs. And so the problem with the original Hacker News API I had kind of constructed with GraphQL was that it didn't conform to this at all. It was just like kids and these other nouns and verbs that really didn't really know what to do with. And then I kind of evolved that into this new version, which actually has proper pagination. So you can see that there's like a page info thing, which tells you information about how the cursors work. It uses edges correctly and cursors and nodes. It uses like query fragments to pick out which type of node you're going to return. And the way I think about this is actually as like idiomatic GraphQL. So instead of like a hodgepodge of different techniques, this actually adds like a little bit more formal structure to your GraphQL endpoint. Like I'm sure everyone's used different REST APIs where they might all nominally be REST, but they have very different patterns between them. And I can imagine that very easily happening with different GraphQL servers, where if you kind of take your application of REST and then just like kind of port it wholesale over to GraphQL, you're going to end up with a very different ecosystem of GraphQL queries that's not going to be portable or take advantage of a lot of the client-side work, like in Relay or other like GraphQL clients that are coming down the pipe. So eventually I arrived at this conclusion that, hey, I should like adopt this idiomatic GraphQL structure. And along the way, like more people started using GraphQLHub. So performance is really important. Here's like a rough graph of the queries per day for GraphQL from the past week. I don't know where a lot of these come from, but it's pretty cool. And it's enough data to actually have some interesting like instrumentation behind. So this is like the number of raw queries that GraphQLHub gets. And this is the queries broken down by which field and resolver. So you can see like the Hacker News API calls are broken down. They take approximately like less than a second. Some of the Reddit API calls are super fast. And then there's a lot of fields in here that I've just like omitted because they're in memory and they're instantaneous. And note that this is the 50% time, so basically median. And then if you go to like 95% of the time, there's some like funky Hacker News API calls that take like over a minute. And it's really important to instrument this. Like whenever you eventually launch a GraphQL server in production, you want to understand how it works. It's not like in REST where you can kind of instrument each endpoint. Like in New Relic, you're going to have one GraphQL endpoint, and you actually need to instrument the system a little bit more in depth. And it still isn't really understood in the open source community how you do this. It really depends on what implementation of GraphQL server you're using. And in this case, like I use the vanilla JavaScript one. And you can actually go on GitHub and see like how this works. It's basically like a drop-in middleware that you add, and you can pipe it out to, in this case, I'm using Keen.io, but you can imagine putting it into statsd or whatever other metrics service you want. And finally, like it's really cool to see as I've kind of like made these changes and like took this little journey with GraphQL, how the community sort of responded. So for example, the Twitter endpoint on GraphQLHub is entirely like a community thing. It was just like a pull request that was open one day, and I thought it was super awesome. And again, this is all like open source. If you're interested in how any of this code works under the hood, or you want to contribute back to it, like go for it. And here's an example of that Twitter endpoint. So you can see that like this is still kind of using a lot of techniques that are just taken from REST. So for example, tweets returns an actual array of tweets, not like a pagination construct. And it's actually kind of hard with APIs that don't natively support cursors to add the kind of cursor-based pagination. And so it'll be cool throughout this year to see more and more APIs adopting that, perhaps using GraphQL natively or inside of REST itself. So yeah, I know that was a really fast talk, but thanks for listening, and check out GraphQLHub. It's pretty neat. So.
Do you have any questions from the audience?
Curious if anyone's tried wrapping the Wikipedia API to GraphQL?
So the question was if anyone's tried wrapping the Wikipedia API in GraphQLHub.
No. That sounds really cool. You should do it. I have like an open PR for the Facebook API, which I think would be kind of interesting to see in GraphQL. And I'm sure like this guy has like, an opinion on how it works. But there's so many APIs out there, and it'd be really cool just to see like how well they can adopt to GraphQL and like go for it. Yeah.
All right. There's another question. So the question was if all the APIs can be consumed by Relay.
So it's actually pretty funny. The first Hacker News GraphQL binding I did basically worked with Relay by coincidence. It happened to be that all the IDs in Hacker News are universally unique. I didn't like impose any restrictions, whereas like in other APIs, that's not the case at all. Like Reddit, like some of the Reddit APIs are like you're going to get ID collisions unless you do something more intelligent. So for now, the Hacker News ones there's a mutations API that's just like a simple key value store. That's definitely compatible with Relay. The other ones probably need a little bit more love to get up to like the pagination sort of stuff. And again, like PRs would be awesome if you're into that. So, yeah.
Oh, there's one more question.
Is there anything, with your experience building GraphQLHub, is there anything that you would change if you could about like the core design of GraphQL or Relay?
So the question was, with your experience of building GraphQLHub, is there anything about GraphQL or Relay that you would change if you could?
I think a lot of the work the Apollo folks are doing, like with integrating Redux into like a GraphQL client, is pretty cool. Besides that, like I'm interested to see how instrumentation and performance factors in as more people adopt GraphQL more widely. I think it's not a very well explored or understood thing. Like there's some really awesome issues that have comments on it, but there's no real like drop-in solution right now. So it'll be cool to see like how that evolves. But nothing specific to the actual like format of GraphQL or anything at this point.
Okay, let's thank Clay again for his talk.